Let's talk about stories a little bit. I think one of the things we fail to realize is that stories are a very, very important part of our life. And they used to be something that we would sit around a fire, or if it was warm, we'd sit around on the beach and someone would tell stories. And that's how it all got started, with us thinking that we were relevant. And this is a good thing, because if we didn't have memory, if we didn't have stories, then we would be like the trees. And the trees are a good thing, but they're not thinking like we are. And part of the reason we like stories is because it helps give us an idea of what our characters can be. And I think it's all right when somebody has various characters, and I think that's part of the thing we should be learning when we study religion. One of the things you can do when you read somebody or somebody's about somebody or somebody's writing, Nietzsche was one of my faves. I never read a whole lot of his stuff because I didn't think I needed to, because I read him and I thought, I know exactly what you mean, man. And when I think, sometimes I think, okay, how would Nietzsche think? And then other times I think, well, how would Wittgenstein think? Or how would Jesus Christ think? Or how would Paulus think? And if you've got it figured out how they think by researching them, by reading about them, then you can actually think like them, and you have a host of characters in your head. Now obviously they're not really speaking to you, but in a way they are part of your character. If you go and read and study the various people of our history. And that's why I think it's very important to avoid watching TV, because they're all the same character. And they're characters that are not really very not very creative. They're all the same. They're all looking for get a big car, drive real fast, and get a hot man or a hot woman. And there isn't much else to it. I mean, there's a little bit more to it. Some of it's a bit funnier, but there's more to be learned by studying a book or studying a bunch of books. And that's why I think it's more important to read books than it is to watch TV. Alright, we'll do a really quick recap of Lord Valentine's Castle. Now there's a character that's quite a bit like our famous Jesus Christ, only a little more like a real king, because he's a real king in the story. And he loses his kingdom. Somebody steals his body and he gets dumped into another body. And but I mean, it's science fiction, but it's still, in a way, it's true. He wakes up not remembering that he's the king, and he spends his whole the whole story trying to figure out who he is. Well, not really trying to figure out who he is. He becomes a juggler, and people can see who he is, and he doesn't know who he is. And that's a very interesting perspective about how to learn about yourself, is not to be too sure of who you are and let other people see who you are. And sometimes them looking at you and seeing you and being the mirror, if you look at enough people, human people, like real people, and animals probably as well, but they will mirror things back at you. And if you're polished your mirror receptors enough, you will start learning things about yourself that you don't know about yourself by the way people react to you and how they respond. And one of the nice things that I've noticed is that people quite often respond with things that they're not really telling you, but they're in there somehow, so that it clicks in your head and it turns something over. It opens a light into a room that you haven't been to yet, and it's usually a room that you sort of want to go to, but you're not sure if you want to go there because it's still dark, because there hasn't been any light shed on it. But when you meet somebody who you have to have trust with them, you have to be able to share openly, they will tell you something that probably doesn't make any sense right away, or it might, if you're lucky, but it might also make sense 3 months later or even 10 years later, and you will see something that you wouldn't have seen had you not paid attention to the things in the message that it was being said that weren't in the words. And if you can make any sense out of that, that is a little bit how the Bible is written. The New Testament, the Old Testament, we're not going to talk about that today, but the characters are characters, and they may be based on real people. And the thing is, they may be based on real people that are in your lives. Their ways of being, their ways of seeing things, and sure, there's a billion ways of seeing things, but in a way, there's only maybe a half a dozen perspectives. And if you read the book, you see that there's these different perspectives, and if you can allow each character to be teaching you something, which for me it was a hard time to deal with Paul, but eventually I even got to the point where I thought, actually Paul makes a lot of sense sometimes, and sometimes he's absolutely wrong, but being absolutely wrong, if you can see it, if you can see that it's put in there so you can notice it, then there's other things that you will see when you look at these things that are absolutely wrong. You'll see, perhaps he put it in absolutely wrong, the writers put it in absolutely wrong, so you would have to think. And if you go into that book and you think, it means something completely different than what the established church has made it into. The established church actually did not want it translated into a language everybody could read. They wanted it for themselves, and before they translated into a language everybody could read, they manipulated the thing almost to death. And you have to be very smart and clever and diligent to understand what might be hinted at, because the things that are and if you go and read other books, for example, Hard Times by Charles Dickens, he does this beautifully all the time. He will tell you things that are simple enough, but if you look at them, you think, okay, this is what he means. And the same thing happens in every book, unless the writer's no good, and then it'll just mean what it means. But in the books of the New Testament, a lot of them are actually a lot better than we give credit to, and there's a lot of subtleties in there. And the subtleties are what matters, because the thing was being written at a time when they weren't allowed to say anything. So you have to go in there and dig. But there is one very obvious point that's been made in the Bible several times by Jesus and by Paul even, and that's that that reincarnation and evolution are pretty well the same thing, and they both were trying to explain this, and it's something that we have learned to think it's completely and utterly wacko shit, but evolution and reincarnation are the same thing with two different perspectives. And another thing, I can't remember what I was going to say, just wait a second, I'll get it. Oh yes, the most important point, and Jesus makes it very often, and I'm pretty sure that somebody wrote in the word kingdom. Jesus would have said, we are here, this is heaven, and it's always written the kingdom of heaven. But what we've got to learn is that it's not a kingdom, it's not owned by the kings. They're called something else now, but it's still the elite. And I've heard it said by other people that there's about 1,000 people that own 80% of the planet, and there's something wrong with that. I mean, the fact that it's possibly true is a very crazy thing, but it is definitely like that. The very small percentage of the people on this planet are the elite, the overlords, and they run the planet, and this is the biggest problem. And it's not theirs, it's ours. And if we can stop believing that heaven is when we die, and that heaven is here, it's going to change everything. And that is what Jesus said over and over and over again. He said heaven is at hand, and what he means is heaven is right now. And it's not something you die for, it is something that is real and tangible, and it's here. And that's the thing we got to start figuring out. And when we start figuring that out, it doesn't matter what your religion is, because we've already landed in heaven. It's just a question of how do we deal with each other.